Solo Leveling Season 2 Episode 12 looked incredible for the most part. It was a major action highlight, the third one from this season, which for a modern action anime is really impressive. Let's break down the visuals, make sure to subscribe. As always, let's go through the stuff first. This episode was directed by Ryotaro Suzuki, while the storyboards were handled by Ryotaro Suzuki and the one and only Yoshihiro Kanno. I believe Kanno storyboarded the action-filled second half of the episode. Episode director and storyboard artist Ryotaro Suzuki is not a Solo Leveling regular. In fact, it was actually his first time working on this project. And I wish I could say more about his style and ability, but unfortunately I'm not that familiar with his resume. The vast majority of his work belongs to the Cardfight Vanguard series and Pokemon, and I'm not an avid viewer of either. I do remember thinking highly of Oregairu Season 3 Episode 11, an episode directed and storyboarded by him, but unfortunately that's all I got. Yoshihiro Kanno, on the other hand, is a name I am familiar with, and so are most of you. He is the main action guy behind Solo Leveling. He is the action director. As many of you already know, he has done an unbelievable amount of work across both seasons of this show. Most recently, he practically carried the Jinwoo vs Baran fight, a fight I've covered in detail before. He storyboarded the whole thing, did a bunch of corrections as the action AD, and animated 3 entire minutes of high-level action, including the finale. Basically, he is an extremely prolific artist, especially when it comes to action. His style of action animation/direction is fast-paced, snappy, bombastic, and a bit hard to read, but intentionally so. As for the rest of the team, it was an all-hands-on-deck situation in both a good and a bad way. Good because they basically gathered every noteworthy animator involved with this project, be it action directors Yoshihiro Kanno and Hirokatsu Maruyama, all 4 main animators, and other recurring names like Ryota Saito and Sotaru Shiraishi. And bad because look at that AD list, good god, 18 individual people and 3 entire studios, that's rough. I've talked about it in my previous video. Solo Leveling is struggling behind the scenes, visibly so. The previous episode looked incredibly rough, and this one, despite being a high priority undertaking, had several rough edges. We'll go through the specifics in a bit. Point is, Solo Leveling, despite how good it looks, is not that different from your typical modern anime in that it faces the same challenges as far as the production is concerned. I will say this though, I think it's really impressive that the core team alone is capable of creating both low and high priority episodes. They don't have to go freelancer hunting every time a major episode pops up, unlike certain other shows. Besides a stray Workreek appearance back in season 1, animation highlights from this show are pretty much exclusively animated by core staff members, and I think that's great. Anyway, that's enough rambling for now. Let's go through this episode scene by scene. First things first, the interior of the cave didn't look the best. The art direction was iffy. It wasn't offensive, I've seen worse, namely Black Clover and Black Clover 2, but it was far from appealing. The backgrounds often looked clunky or drab and jarring, although in the show's defense, most projects tend to struggle with this particular aesthetic. The episode started off with some relatively unremarkable action. This cut looked cool. I think there's some degree of Kanno corrections involved, and the CGI models weren't bad, but things really started to pop off once Beru showed up. As such, let's focus on that fight instead. I loved this shot. The drawings were amazing, complete with the rich 3-tone shading, and the head movement was so well done. The hair moves in the direction of the head and stops and gets pushed back when the head stops moving due to inertia. So good. It's short, but you can see some cool perspective work here. Sung's fingers are foreshortened for a frame followed by his fist moving backwards. All of that makes this simple movement feel snappy and energetic. This shot looked amazing. Not only can you see Sung punch the camera, you can see him drop back thanks to these quick smooth smears. The punch itself feels incredibly powerful due to 1. the snappy wind effects, 2. these amazing impact frames, and 3. the general timing and spacing. The motion feels heavy. Incredible drawings too. The fist is so well drawn. I believe this section was animated by Hirokatsu Maruyama mainly based on the timing of the effects. One thing I'd like to point out, it's nothing major but it made me laugh. Look at this frame. That perspective does him no favors, does it? He's not beating those Sung Jinwoo allegations anytime soon. The exchange of strikes here is so energetic. Each strike is preceded by an appropriate amount of build-up and followed by the appropriate amount of release. This scene, for example, Beru doesn't just hit him, he lifts his body up. The camera pans upwards, complete with these smeary blobs used to convey motion. The scene then switches to a wide-angle shot accompanied by a quick downward quick pan to further convey the impact. All of this is then followed by a bunch of effects. The next strike starts with an animated zoom out, followed by Sung closing in. Again, build up and release. Each strike feels heavy. Love this shot in particular. The camera movement trails behind the action. You have the initial wind effects followed by the quick pan to the corner and back, and then we see the complete impact, aka the zoom out, the wind, and the ground falling apart. I won't go through every single strike, they followed the same general formula. The actual 2D animation wasn't too over the top, but the scenes moved in the right places, and the accompanying camera work and effects added a lot. Also, the slow motion shot was insanely well drawn. Just look at the intricate shading and the sheer number of lines, it's unreal. Most of this exchange was animated by Sans, although according to him, it was heavily corrected by Yoshihiro Kanno. Of course, it wasn't all good, you could see some jank here and there. Shots like these, for example, had a certain degree of stiffness to them, although I'm sure most won't even notice. See how Sung turning looks a bit robotic. It's slightly choppy, most likely due to faulty in-betweening. A couple of dynamic shots follow, this one in particular looks great. The exaggerated arc of Sung's body looks amazing, but at the same time, the character cell is completely off sync with the background to the point where it looks jarring. Sung took a single step forward, but it looked like he was gliding. The background here is in 3D, so it's just a basic photography error. But hey, don't let that distract you from the fact that this scene is really well animated. Like I said, the arc of his body is so energetic. Loved the camera work here. The camera follows the motion, but it's delayed by a second or two, which is inherently cool. I guess this is the point where you accuse me of nitpicking because I have to point a few things out. 1. A lot of these shots melt. You can see the inconsistencies between each frame if you really pay attention. It's not a big deal, of course, but I have to point this stuff out. Also, very poor drawings in this shot, it looks rough. Some of these shots were simply standard. They moved, but there wasn't much to the movement. Even the more ambitious shots, this bit of large-scale background animation, for example, had a certain amount of jank to them. Here are a few more examples. This axe kick looked really cool, but the build-up portion of this cut was clearly hiding behind extreme close-ups. The debris in this cut just straight up disappears. The hand-drawn cubic shapes seemingly melt into the background layer, which looks a bit jarring. You get my point, right? You can see the issues if you know what to look for. Even animation producer Atsushi Kaneko in his tweet hyping the episode up made mention of these rough edges. You can accuse me of nitpicking all you want. Solo leveling fans don't take kindly to criticism of any kind, but that won't change the fact that this show is clearly struggling in some places. It is. And I think it's important to point that stuff out. You got all of that? Great. Now forget everything I said. The fight from this point on looked absolutely bonkers. This transformation sequence was insane. The quivering, volatile body language coupled with the plethora of impact frames, the thick line art, and the massive amounts of 2D hatching looked phenomenal. Also, as you'd expect from any high-calorie henshin transformation sequence, the drawings themselves were incredibly good, plus the compositing allowed the colors to pop out. This entire section is presumed to be Hajime Nakagawa's work, by the way. Nakagawa animated a huge chunk of action for this episode, and this was the highlight. Moving on, loved the organic shading on the daggers. This shot looked a bit rough, the drawings were jumpy, and the background-foreground sync was off, but hey, it's not a big deal. Not sure how I feel about this shot. On one hand, I love me a good, raw, idiosyncratic expression, but on the other, it looks less like that and more like a weak drawing. Sung looks bug-eyed here. The level of movement then steps up a notch. The strikes are faster and have more energy, and the storyboards are more complex with unorthodox perspectives and lengthy exchanges. The action is clearly escalating. Loved that creepy foreshortening thing they did to Beru's head. They did it on 2 different occasions. The fight from this point on featured constant action. No breaks, minimal dialogue, just non-stop movement, and that's incredibly difficult to execute. Also, the storyboards were so good. Sung flips over Beru and throws him overhead, but Beru counters by doing the same thing. The scene then cuts to a front profile of Sung as he flies backwards and Beru chases him. This sequence is then followed by an ultra-wide side profile zoom in with the exchange of strikes is conveyed by these color-coded streaks of light. This is followed by a close-up of the blades clashing and then followed by a mid-shot of the exchange. You get my point, right? It keeps going, it's one thing after another. Things keep building up. Beru summons ice at one point, Sung dodges them, but Beru shatters the pillars and throws pieces of the ice at him. Sung then dodges those, but the impact causes the floor to give out, the two then fight while the debris falls to the ground, which reminded me of Fate Heaven's Feel. Just the concept of it, nothing else. Fate Heaven's Feel actually featured good looking caves. Anyway, point is, it's one thing after another, non-stop movement and the animation keeps up. I won't sit here and pretend like every shot featured top-notch 2D sakuga, they didn't, but the scene flowed so well. The actions had meaning and the movement/animation ranged from gets the job done to really fucking good. Somewhere around this point, the style of action switched from fast-paced to overwhelming, and who better to animate an overwhelming action scene than Yoshihiro Kanno himself. Kanno handled around 40 seconds of key animation here, although this scene isn't confirmed to be his work as of this recording, so I might be wrong, but come on, I'm not. It is him, it's obvious. Kanno used a lot of light streaks and flares this time around. There were entire cuts where the characters were represented through these color-coded flares. Since light flares don't have arms or legs, these cuts conveyed intensity purely through the timing. Also, when I say light, I mean it. The characters were treated as literal light sources. You can see them light up parts of these pillars. Does that make sense? No. Does it need to? Also no. The background just straight up disappeared during this section, by the way. It was replaced by this purple gradient. In storyline, it's meant to represent speed. The characters are moving so fast that the background cannot catch up. And from a technical POV, it's done because a traditional background would make the scene look overly busy and interfere with the camera work. A presumably unintended side effect of this background removal was that it led to the mediocre cave backgrounds not being on screen, which is a massive win. Insanely well drawn close-up here. The curvature of the eyes conveyed through masterful line placement, the volume accentuated by the depth of field blur on the far eye. It looks insane. That alone would be great, but the scene moves. The face twitches and the pupils are smeary and erratic. This is genuinely one of my favorite shots from this episode. We then get some character animation. It's incredibly fast-paced but competently animated. Also, the ground was fully hand-drawn, although the textures added on top were a bit obnoxious. The characters then turned into light streaks for a few seconds before returning to their human form. Kanno let the sheer intensity of the action speak. You probably couldn't follow every single strike, but you could feel the weight. Also, the action might be fast, but that doesn't mean Kanno skimped out on the drawings. This scene actually contains some of the best Sung Jin-woo drawings ever. Each frame is a work of art. Just look at them, they look incredible. Not sure how much of it is due to the corrections. If I had to guess, I'd say Kanno's animation deserves a lot of the credit, given the messy AD list. Sung throwing his daggers looked so energetic, the way his body bends and smears help convey the force. We got a couple of really well drawn close-ups followed by Sung Sasukeing Beru. Again, for the millionth time, look at the quality of the drawings, so good. Also, the line art around the sections closer to the camera was thicker, which added a lot. It made the scenes pop out. Up next was Takafumi Tori's animation, which was more snappy and pose-to-pose. Beru's body language had so much energy packed into it, you could feel the impact. Also, much like Kanno's sequence, the drawing quality was insane. These are some of the best drawings in the entire show. This close-up in particular was immaculate. The detailed pupil, the curvature of the eye, the meticulously drawn eyelashes, the volume, it's perfect. Loved this heavy camera movement. The moving debris conveys a sense of weight and space, which in turn makes the camera work feel forceful. Also, here's an incredibly consistent animated zoom out, because why not? These two shots could have used an extra frame or two, they looked choppy, but besides that, this sequence was insanely good looking. This close-up with the pencil-like hatching looked beautiful, and this final strike was, as you'd expect, amazing. Sung does like 4 barrel rolls in the air before slashing at the camera. The scene then switches to a side profile complete with a perfectly placed slow-motion shot and more slashes. The exchange finally ends with this heavily detailed explosion and some wonderful build-up and release on Sung landing. This was followed by some many versus many combat, the highlights being this lovely bit of dragon animation and the effects around dusk. And speaking of effects, the fire looked so good. The effect loops had a lot of frames so they didn't look stiff. We then got a few money shots. The drawing quality was high as you'd expect, and the hair and fabric animation was on point. If I remember correctly, a version of this shot was shown in the very first trailer. It's redrawn, but it's the same thing. A smooth, well-drawn flurry of strikes then then brings us to the end. What a fight the team went off. Yes, it had its rough edges, that's bound to happen given the nature of the production, but in my opinion the positives outweighed the negatives. Fantastic fight all around. And that should just about do it. I wanted to include a section where I went over my top 5 fights or something like that, but the video is long enough already, so maybe some other day. That's about it. Liked the video? Check out this other bit of content on screen, like and subscribe, and until next time.